Good morning, all you saints at Zion. It's good to be with you on this Sunday morning. And this week, my sermon is entitled Wisdom from Above. We're going to be looking at James chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. It was great to be with many of you last weekend at the CFO Day at the park, and also then at Zion on Sunday morning with Kenny and Kim Davis. It was great to hear from them, and it's great to see a lot of you. Anyway, this week though, I'm going to be continuing where I left off in James chapter 3. If you remember, my last sermon was 2 weeks ago at Zion, and I talked about chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 of James. And so I'm going to quick do a review of that here. And the last sermon, it was in that very well-known section of James that talks about the power of the tongue. And in that section, James goes on to talk about how the tongue is very destructive, and how that a man that can control his tongue can control his whole, has self-control. If he can control his tongue, he can control his whole body. And he likens the tongue to like the rudder of a ship, where a very small part can turn a very large thing, or the bit in a horse's mouth, how this small thing can turn such a large animal, and how the words we say it can kind of be a hinge upon where our lives turn. We can say things that lead us down paths that are not good, or just how destructive the tongue can be. He says no one can tame the tongue. It's almost like he's saying there's no hope, And in my sermon, if you remember, if you watched it or if you were there for it, I talked about how these issues, it's actually a lot deeper than just our tongue. This is kind of like a heart issue. And, James is looking for the people that he's writing this letter to. He's looking for them to be people who have a consistency in their lives, where there is blessing coming out of their mouths, not blessing one day and cursing another. James was dealing, a lot of historians believe James was dealing with a lot of discord and division in the churches that he was overseeing, and that he was writing this book to try to come against some of these people who were with their mouths saying things that was creating so much division and hurting so many people. And so we're going to look at this passage a little more in depth here. So I'm going to go ahead and read James chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. And it's almost as if this section, before I read it, I'm going to just say this, that this section is kind of almost like James' answer to the seeming impossibility of what we looked at 2 weeks ago, of the impossibility of the self-control that is needed to tame the tongue. And he begins to talk about a wisdom that comes from above. And so we're going to look at this. I'm going to start by reading it here. So we're in James chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit more. And as I said, this is kind of like an answer to the impossibility of the first 12 verses of chapter 3, where he's talking about the tongue and just how, terrible the tongue is. And so when we look here at this section of verses 13 and 17, so you have verses that are at the beginning and the very end of this passage, and they kind of are like bookends. It kind of like starts out talking about wisdom and it ends talking about wisdom. These are like wisdom bookends. And these two bookends, they kind of flank verses 14, 15, and 16. And that's kind of the ugly stuff in the middle here in this passage. Now, remember, you know, James is, if you look back in the previous section in verses 1 through 12, you know, all of the things in verses 14, 15, and 16 in the center section here, they're talked about in the first part. Like you look at verse 6, it talks about how the tongue is a fire and a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members and staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, set on fire by hell itself, James says. You know, these ugly things that James is talking about here, he's referencing back to the opening part of chapter 3. You know, Tim Mackey, one of the founders of the Bible Project, he makes it very evident that he believes that it's very evident that James, being a half-brother of Jesus, was drawing primarily a lot on Jesus's teaching. So you could, when I say Jesus's teaching, you could think like Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking about the kingdom and what it's like to live in the kingdom. And James is also drawing heavily on Proverbs too. So you have a lot of this talk about wisdom, you know, because that is, Proverbs is a book of wisdom. And so these are a lot of the main things that James is drawing on to do this. Okay, so let's start looking here at verse 13. Verse 13 is just very packed with a lot of meaning. And when I first read it, I didn't quite grasp all of it. I looked at the original language that it was written in, and there's some words here that I'm going to pull out because there's some depth of meaning here that is kind of lost as we read through it in English. So in the very beginning here, it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" That word understanding there, the word has to do with knowledge that is learned over a long period of time. So knowledge that you have from a long term. So who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct. Let's look at that word good there. I'm reading out of the ESV. Your translation might be a little bit different. By his good conduct. That word good there, that is a word that means something that is beautiful, something that is like attractively good, a goodness that actually inspires others to goodness. So this isn't about he's not talking about some guy who's just being good, like following the rules. He's talking about beautiful way of living. And then the next word, conduct. That word conduct, that has to do with like how you deal with other people, your dealings with other people. It also could mean like an outward sign of an inward belief. So James is saying by his beautiful dealings with other people. It's amazing to think of it that way. By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So right away, the word meekness kind of jumped out at me, and I wanted to look at that a little more. That word meekness there, it means like gentle strength. It means like an expression of power with reserve. What I mean by reserve is like an expression of power where you're like holding some of your power back, where you're dealing, even though you have strength and power, you're dealing it out very gently and with kindness. This idea of gentle strength. So, you know, I was trying to think of an illustration of gentle strength. I was trying to think of a way to like illustrate it, like have a story or something from my life or something I heard about. And so Mary and I were talking, and we thought, like, is there an animal maybe that exemplifies gentle strength? So I decided to do a Google search. And, you know, Google, yes, I searched Google. I typed in animals with gentle strength, you know, to see what I would come up with. And Google can be a jackpot sometimes. Other times, you know, it's a big strikeout. So I typed in animals with gentle strength, and this is what I came up with right here. If you can see that. Yes, if you're not sure what that animal is, that is an animal called a tapir. Now, I'm not sure that we're going to learn a whole lot about a tapir. I found this on a website called spiritanimal.com, and spiritanimal.com was very thin on details as to why a tapir exemplifies gentle strength. So I think we're going to have to explore this idea ourselves and figure out what gentle strength looks like. So gentle strength, it's something that like It's when you have, meekness. We often think of meekness in our English language, meekness being something like somebody who's meek and mild and easily run over. But this word here in the Greek, it actually is very strong. It means strength with gentleness, strength with like one hand behind your back, kind of like where you're holding back your strength. So I took the liberty of kind of like translating this verse 13 a little bit for myself, just to kind of like make it make sense to me. And here's what I kind of came up with. Who is wise and has shown that over a long period? By the beautiful, attractive way he interacts with others, he shows his deeds with strong, gentle insight. So I don't know if that maybe helps you, but James obviously, literally when I read this verse, I'm thinking of like the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus is talking about the kingdom, what the kingdom of heaven is like. When we choose to walk in the wisdom that comes from above, it is a beautiful thing to people around us. It is something that typically draws people to us when we walk with wisdom, when we walk with a meekness, what he calls the meekness of wisdom. That is something that's very appealing to people. This idea of wisdom in the Bible, of being beautiful, this is not this isn't a concept that James would have come up with. There's a very you see that wisdom being represented in the Bible as a woman, and as a beautiful woman. And in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 9, this is one example. There's many others. This is a father's instruction to his son. And in chapter 4, verse 9 of Proverbs, he says, "She will place on your head a graceful garland, and she will bestow on you a beautiful crown." Wisdom is something that is very beautiful. That is something that is very, it draws people to it because it is good. And I think that's why James is bringing out this idea of wisdom after the first 12 verses of chapter 3 as kind of like the answer to this problem of the tongue. Okay, so now we're going to look at verses 14, 15, and 16 right here in the center. And James is clearly contrasting. He has this first verse of 13, the end verse of 17, and then 18 on the end. And they're kind of like bookends. And then contrasted in the middle is this ugliness that we're going to look at now, the ugliness of jealousy and selfish ambition. But he's obviously contrasting the two, between the beauty of wisdom and the ugliness of jealousy. So verses 14, 15, and 16. "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." Now, right here, I'm going to say, I believe James is reaching back into the earlier part of chapter 3. You look back at verses 5 and 6. I already read verse 6. But in verse 5 and 6 of chapter 3, he's talking about the tongue and how it causes so much problems. He talks about the boasts of the tongue, how the tongue boasts great things, and how out of that comes such conflict, such fires, like an entire forest is burnt down from it. And how the tongue is actually set on fire from hell itself. So he's reaching back there, and he's kind of expounding on it here in verses 14, 15, and 16. But then if you look ahead a little bit to chapter 4, the first couple verses of chapter 4 is basically going on to describe like open warfare, open fighting. In other words, what this leads to, all of this jealous ambition and these boasts and everything, it actually leads to very bad things. It leads to fighting and quarreling. And he actually uses the word murder in here, fleshly passions. What he means by fleshly passions there is like ambition and trying to grasp and grab hold of things that you want for yourself. So these things, these opposite things from what wisdom is, they lead to very bad things. So kind of like, if you remember 2 weeks ago, James was talking about the tongue, and you get to the end of the passage and it seems kind of hopeless. He says, no one can tame it, and here we are here in verses 14, 15, and 16. And it almost seems it's like, you begin to ask yourself the question, are we like doomed? Are we like doomed as people to say things that hurt, to say things that divide groups of people, to self-promote ourselves? So what is the answer to this? I don't think probably a whole lot has changed since the first century. I'd say I see a lot of the same stuff here in the 21st century. It seems to be the same. But here we come then in the next verse, in verse 17. And 18 is kind of tacked onto that at the end. This is James's answer. This wisdom, we need to remember, this wisdom from above that James is talking about. This wisdom is not from inside of ourselves. This is not something that comes from inside of us. Instead, it comes from outside of us. It comes from, as James said, above. It comes from God. When we choose to live according to it, he lists the things here. But the wisdom from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial and sincere. If we have our hearts filled with a critical spirit, with selfish ambition, with jealousy, with self-promotion, it's going to be very hard to let this beautiful wisdom of God in if our hearts are full of all these things. When we have our fleshly desires running our lives and running our mouths, we'll be saying things that are hurtful, and we'll be letting those fleshly passions govern what we do. These things that we're grasping at and reaching for. And then we come to verse 18, and the opposite of all of the things that he listed in verse 14, 15, and 16. He talks about a harvest of righteousness that is sown in peace by those who make peace. Once again, we have these agrarian terms that James had used earlier. I know I preached on a passage in the first chapter of James. And in there, he uses the agrarian terms. He uses the idea of a seed being sown, that the word of God is a seed sown into our hearts, and that it produces righteousness. And here again, he's talking about this harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. This is agrarian language that would have been very familiar to James and to the people he was writing to. This verse reminds me of Hebrews 12, verse 11. Now, in the writer in Hebrews, in chapter 12, verse 11, he's talking about the discipline that comes with the persecution that these people were experiencing. And in verse 11, he says, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So for those people who allow it, this discipline of God in their lives, for those people who allow the hard times to teach them, they have a harvest. They have the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Peace is actually a result of operating in wisdom. Rather than following all of our fleshly passions and desires, when we operate out of, say, like insecurity and things like that, we harvest righteousness, which is sown in peace. Righteousness comes out of living a life of peace. I'm going to read the Message. Many of you know of the paraphrase of the Bible done by Eugene Peterson. And I thought what he wrote, it helped me very clearly see this contrast between a life lived by wisdom and a life lived by selfishness. And here's what Eugene Peterson, this is the entire translation of chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. This is the Message. "Do you want to be counted wise, to build a reputation for wisdom? Here's what you do. Live well, live wisely, Live humbly. It's the way you live, not the way you talk, that counts. Mean-spirited ambition isn't wisdom. Boasting that you are wise isn't wisdom. Twisting the truth to make yourselves sound wise isn't wisdom. It's the furthest thing from wisdom. It's animal cunning, devilish plotting. Whenever you're trying to look better than others or get the better of others, things fall apart and everyone ends up at the other's throat. Real wisdom, God's wisdom, begins with a holy life and is characterized by getting along with others. It is gentle and reasonable, overflowing with mercy and blessings, not hot one day and cold the next, not two-faced. You can develop a healthy, robust community that lives right with God and enjoy its results only if you do the hard work of getting along with each other and treating each other with dignity and honor. I thought that was helpful to understand the contrast that James was trying to get at here in these verses. So that brings us to the question, what does this mean for us today here in 2021? Well, I think what it means is that when we find ourselves being led to say things out of when we find ourselves saying things out of jealousy, out of insecurity, out of a selfish motivation, or quite frankly, maybe we're just out of patience. We've lost our patience and we want to say something with our mouths that is going to be hurtful. Or like when you're in a moment where you want to quote unquote shoot off your mouth because someone upset you about something, or maybe just because you feel that you have the right to do it. Or maybe you're just having a cranky day. That happens sometimes. I would say stop. And respond instead with the wisdom that comes from above. Now, I know that you probably think, I thought this as I said that sounds awful pat and awful formulaic, Matt. Oh yeah, when you're angry and you want to spout off, oh, just stop and respond with the wisdom from above. Like that's easy to do. No, it's not easy to do. And this is where, this idea of self-control comes in. When I say that might sound kind of pat and formulaic, it isn't actually. That is actually what we need to do. In verse 13, when he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" That word understanding, it's something that we come to over time. This is a process of learning how to have wisdom in what we say. It's like a muscle that you start to work that hasn't been worked in a long time. And when you begin exercising it, it's hard at first. It's very hard. And then it gets a little easier. But it always takes work. If you stop working it, it begins to get weak again. So it always takes work. It's not something that you arrive at and you finally have it and you don't have to think about it anymore. Really what this is, this idea of responding with wisdom, this is really actually about self-sacrifice. It's about sacrificing your impulse to say something for the sake of others, to be gentle to them, to love them, to sow peace for a harvest of righteousness. Walking in wisdom from above, it takes self-control. It really does. Where you actually decide that you are going to be a peacemaker. That you're going to be a peacemaker who sows peacefully the seeds of righteousness. It's actually comes down to a choice. When we operate in the wisdom from above, that is when we can, this is what's wonderful about the wisdom from above, that is when we can actually get to the truth about things, where our words can actually bring healing and life, not chaos and hurt. When we operate in wisdom, that's when we can actually minister to people. when we can actually get to the truth of a matter. Honestly, it's like when we get ourselves out of the way and we actually walk in wisdom. Really, this actually comes from our heart, not from the muscle that lives inside of our mouth. It comes from that source. Our words come from our heart. And I think that's really what James is getting at here. So for all of us at Zion and for myself, let us be people who speak with the wisdom that comes from above, where we are sowing seeds of righteousness in peace. Pray with me. God, I just thank you so much that you have given us the wisdom that comes from you. That, it says in the Bible that wisdom was there with you at the beginning of the creation of the world. And God, I pray that you would instill in us here at Zion, in our lives, this wisdom that comes from above, this wisdom that comes from understanding, this wisdom that we operate with meekness and humility in. God, I just pray that would be something that each and every one of us in our own unique way would walk out. That we would be people who speak blessing and not blessing and curse out of the same well. We just thank you so much for who you are. We just pray that you would help us to walk in your wisdom. Amen. All right, join me now in a benediction. This is from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. Finally, brothers, rejoice, aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace be with you. Amen.